Hey everyone, it's Paul from Alexander Knife Sharpenings. I wanted to do just a quick video on this because I know when I first started sharpening, this kind of confused the heck out of me, and I just want to touch on this topic, and it's going to be talking about abrasive measurements, standards, names, units, and what we do kind of sometimes as sharpeners to make it a little more simple. And keep in mind that we're also dealing with different country standards. So what does that mean? I live in the US. As a kid when I was in school, I had wood shop, I had metal shop, and where I grew up, and as a kid, my first experience with abrasives was like in wood shop as a kid, and we had 80 grit sandpaper, and we had 400 grit sandpaper and 1000 grit sandpaper. That was like all we had, like 3 of them. And I knew 80 grit was coarse, and I knew 400 was kind of in the middle, and 1000 was really fine. I didn't even know till way on later in life that there's actually tons and tons of standards for abrasives. And we all, wherever we're from, if we tend to think like, everybody uses this, but the truth is that every country has their own abrasive standards. So Russia has abrasive standards. Japan has their own abrasive standards. Many countries have their own abrasive standards, and they're not all the same. And they don't all call things grit. Some use microns, some use mesh. When I tell you there's a ton, I will just cut in a chart and I'll put a link to it. Gritomatic has a great one that you can go look up different standards. So even between companies and even between abrasive belt makers, they can be very, very different. And I remember the first time this started confusing me was when I bought my Ken Onion Elite, and the belts came, and they're Norwax belts, and they have like an X something number on them, and I was like, what is this? What is an X15 belt? I had no idea what it was. And I was like, well, I don't understand this. What does this number mean? Is a big number mean it's a coarse grit? Is it a small? Why does it have a letter? And then I got into Trizac belts and realized, oh, wow, these have an A standard. It's like an A30, an A15. So you start going like, well, what is going on here? And that's what you find out, is that they all have their different standards. So what a lot of us do, and what I did at the time to keep it simple for myself, like since grit made sense to me, I would write that on the back of a belt. And I'm just going to grab one because I still do it sometimes, even to this day, just out of habit, even though I know the difference now. So like this is a A30 belt. Now, after doing it for years, I know it's 800 grit. So I would write 800 on the back of it. Now I mostly write on them for the date when I started using it, so I know when I replace it, because I replace them about monthly. But in the beginning, I was like confused. I couldn't remember what all the different systems were, and some of the things were using microns, and I was like, oh, this drives me crazy. So I just write on them. So if you're starting out, if you're not sure and you want to kind of have an idea, where is this abrasive? Are we oversimplifying it? Yes, we're oversimplifying it, but for us as sharpeners, we just want to know where it's kind of falling on the abrasive scale. Now, why is that oversimplifying? In some ways, it is because it can be a little confusing when we start. As you guys know, I have several videos on polishing, and we'll refer to the 3M radial discs by a grit number. And then they'll even sometimes throw in microns, which is kind of funny because some companies start mixing things together. So if you look at the radial discs, they usually use grit on the red ones at 220 grit. 400 grit is, the blue color. But then when you get up into the green, which is the really high polishing ones, they usually call that 1 micron, which is around 14,000 grit. So a lot of times we just do the conversion to kind of, in our own head, know where it's on the scale of abrasive. Is it coarse? Is it fine? But keep in mind, they don't all perform the same. So a 220 grit radial disc polishing abrasive is not the equivalent of a 200 grit Cubitron belt that you're going to use on a sander. Far different. Nowhere near in comparison, but it's just a way to know where it is on the scale. But know that when you're dealing with that individual abrasive, it doesn't correspond to a different style of abrasive. And where is this really important? Like if you're a manufacturer of CBN wheels and that kind of stuff, it is important to know if you're buying abrasives, if you're buying, diamonds to embed into wheels, and you're getting it from one country or a different country or multiple countries, you do need to look up a chart to see like, well, what is their 1.5 micron, or what is their measurement equivalent to what we use here. But for us as sharpeners, basically you're getting like kind of deep into the weeds, and so you can either kind of try and know the different systems, or you can kind of in your own mind put it on one thing that makes sense to you, which is kind of what I've always done. So I always talk about things in grit. Now that I've done it for so many years, like the two I kind of understand real easily are kind of Micron and grit. But I'll still, like, when I started messing with making my own diamond sprays, I wrote, you can see because all that comes in microns. I wrote 1 micron is around 22,000 grit. These are the grit numbers. 2.5, 8,000. A 4 micron is around 5,000. And I just did that for my own mind so that I know, hey, if I grabbed this or grabbed that, where it fell on the scale. So I hope that makes sense to you guys. It just doesn't correspond between different types of abrasives. It's just a scale to know where it is. Is it coarse or is it really, really fine? It does not mean that they perform the same when we're using different abrasives. I hope that explanation makes sense. All right, everybody. So some final thoughts on belts and recommendations for you on belts, especially for the new people out there. One of the big mistakes I see a lot of people making when they first get into trying to sharpen their own stuff is buying cheap belts. So they will go to like Harbor Freight or Amazon and get just some cheap no-name zirconian belts, and they find out that they sharpen 3 or 4 knives and the belt is worthless. It's not sharpening anymore. It doesn't work. You don't want to buy cheap belts, okay? There are specific belts that we use for sharpening that are really great, that almost every sharpener that I know uses, and there are some places where we tend to get them from. I buy the majority of my belts from a guy named Cliff Curry. Cliff knows tons and tons about sharpening. Many of us have learned a lot that we know from Cliff. But the other thing is he is a great resource for fantastic belts for a lot of different style machines, especially 1x30s. So these red colored belts here, these are Cubitron belts. They are in my opinion, the very best aggressive belt out there for doing corrective work, taking chips out of knives. I always start with a 3M Cubitron. They come in 120 grit. They come in lots of grits. They come in low grits too, 50. I think the lowest I own are 50s. Then you get into like 120, 180. I think there's a 65 something in there. But the one I use the most for me is 120 grit. And if he runs out, I'll buy 180 grits. Both very similar. That's my starting point. Then when I start going into sharpening, then I switch to another 3M product called Trizac belts. I also get those from Cliff, and they work really great also. And once again, these are belts that are going to last you a lot longer than a cheap belt from like Harbor Freight. I change my belts monthly, so I get almost a full month's use out of my Cubitron and Trizac belts before I switch them out. They're worth the extra money. I've never had a person that I've taught sharpening to or turned on to these belts that has ever said to me, oh, I'm going back to my Harbor Freight belts. Even if you're only sharpening your own stuff and you're only going to get like, one set of belts because you don't have a sharpening business, you want to sharpen your own stuff, buy one set. Buy just a handful of these. They will last you a really long time if you're only doing your own stuff. And trust me, you'll be like, wow, Paul, you're right. These are so much better than, no-name belts from a Harbor Freight. The main reason why that is because, keep in mind, the belts that you're seeing at Harbor Freight, they're made for woodworking. They're made for softer materials. Now I'll give you two other names of places where you can get belts. That would be Combat Abrasives and Red Label Abrasives. They also sell very good belts, but they're geared towards knife makers and knife sharpeners. I do like them because there are some things there that I don't get from Cliff because he doesn't have them. One of them has what are called J-Flex belts, which are really flexible belts that twist and turn real easily. They're great for, I really like them for working with handles. Those are just two more resources, but my main one, like I said, Cliff Curry for my sharpening belts, and occasionally Red Label or Combat Abrasives for the other ones. And that's the only three places that I will buy belts from. And that's it. So I just wanted to give you that. If you're on my YouTube, go to the top of my YouTube channel. In the other links places, there is a link to Cliff Curry in there. There's a link to, I think, Combat Abrasives in there. I have all those links there where you can go and find them real easily. I will also put them in the description of this video so that you can find them. But that's where I get my belts, and that's really all I have to say about belts. Have a great day, everybody.